What's going on, y'all? Welcome back to chapter 11 of the Sympathizer. We are in for kind of a long one today. Going to be a lot to get through with this chapter. We see a lot of different looks here, and yeah, just a lot of different and interesting stuff goes on. So I'm not going to really get too deep into this introduction. We're just going to kind of get straight into it. A little broad stroke summary, a little play-by-play, and then kind of a deep dive into the one of the main ideas of the chapter. So here we go. Broad stroke summary coming right at you. The Sympathizer reflects on an early lesson from Mon. The Hamlet finishes filming. A pyrotechnics accident nearly kills the Sympathizer, and in the hospital, the Sympathizer confronts the memory of an interrogation gone wrong or right. So like I said, a lot goes on in this chapter. I know that summary was not really that indicative of the kind of expansive nature of this chapter, but it really feels like this one is one of the longer ones in the book so far. I'm not sure if that's true, or maybe it's just the fact that so much happens that it feels a bit longer than everything else, but really good chapter here with a lot to kind of parse through, for better or for worse. So play-by-play summary, we're going to kind of get into things, and as they sort of trigger memories, I will expand on some topics, kind of glaze over some stuff as well that we might not necessarily need to devote so much time and attention to. But yeah, here we go. Play-by-play summary of Sympathizer, Chapter 11. So right off the bat, we get into the deep dive topic of this week, which is the Hamlet as a propaganda piece for America. There's a lot to cover with this topic, so suffice to say that the chapter begins with the Sympathizer reflecting on an early lesson from Mon in revolutionary politics, and we learn of his placement as a mole in the Vietnamese Republican Army. The Hamlet continues on schedule with a lot of the more elaborate and spectacular scenes being filmed during this chapter. Gunfights, explosions, gruesome deaths, a napalm strike by the Filipino Air Force effectively levels the Hamlet, turns it into a ghost town. A lot of the extras are bloodied, broken, some missing limbs, some falsely disemboweled with sausages, some with their brains kind of dashed out on the ground. So needless to say, we're getting to kind of the climax of the Hamlet, and therefore the climax of the Hamlet storyline. So with the stage set for the final confrontation between the Green Berets and King Kong, we finally get, the Green Berets winning eventually. We get a bit of the script here, which I think is a cool little addition, just a little bit of a drop in with a few of the lines from the film. They see the brothel proprietor, who they refer to as Mama-san, coming out of the cave and kind of wailing over a dead soldier that is kind of littered on the battlefield. And Bellamy says, "Christ, Mama-san's VC," to which Seamus responds, "They all are, kid, they all are." I think it kind of showcases a lot of what the auteur is thinking about the kind of Vietnam War situation with this little segment here, and this also kind of ties into the film being used as a propaganda piece, which, like I said, we'll get into a lot more towards the end of the conversation. Obviously, not every Vietnamese person is Viet Cong, but the film will paint them as such. It's also important, I think, to note that the extras responsible for the death of Bin and the rape of Mai are killed by Seamus on camera. Revenge is kind of dealt for the heinous acts committed by the VC soldiers, so a little bit of catharsis for the viewer in watching them be killed on screen for the most part. The thespian is killed 18 times by Mama-san, and she is in turn killed by Bellamy. The thespian, after 7 months of filming, still has not bathed, and so it causes the idol to have a teary-eyed response while he clutches him to his breast and basically mourns his death through watery eyes because of the smelly actor. Bellamy then calls in the arc-light strike that flattens King Kong's lair and the surrounding countryside. We get a little more from the Sympathizer here, discussing the nature of the film being American propaganda. Kind of everything in this chapter ties into that main idea. So look at all the events of this chapter a little bit through that lens, and I think it'll make things make a little bit more sense. So in an interesting and potentially personally motivated twist, the auteur rewrites the script to include the destruction of the Hamlet cemetery. The Sympathizer mentions to Harry that he loves the cemetery, but there's unfortunately nothing that can be done to save it. So the Sympathizer makes one final pilgrimage to say goodbye. He visits to pay his final respects to his mother, whom he entombed there, if only symbolically, at the start of the film. He reflects on the brief life that she led, her lack of opportunity, and the final indignity of the cemetery being destroyed. The moment is really tender and special. It's cut short, though, by the Sympathizer kind of having an auditory hallucination of the Major's laugh. You know, he's still really broken up about the Major, obviously, and it's kind of infecting every part of his life at this point. And even, 7 months later, 8 months later, however long it's been, and the thousands of miles that he has kind of distanced himself from the actual area of the murder taking place, he's still really broken up about things. Just an interesting and important thing to kind of take note of again. The Sympathizer is then involved in what would later be deemed an accident due to a faulty blasting cap, in which the cemetery is destroyed with him inside. And after a vision of the tunnel of light leading to death, or potentially the first tunnel of light that we experience when we're coming into the world, he reawakens in a hospital bed in Manila. We learn from the doctor that he suffered first-degree burns, smoke inhalation, bruises, and a concussion. And we get a little bit more of the dancing around of the Sympathizer's name. The doctor asks him if he remembers his name, to which the Sympathizer just simply nods. He is in shock at this point, unable to speak following the explosion. So maybe we'll get the Sympathizer's name, maybe not, but not yet, not right now. The doctor says that the Sympathizer is incredibly lucky to have walked away from the accident without any broken limbs or worse, and he leaves with advising bed rest and saying, no matter how badly you might feel, take comfort in knowing there's someone who feels much worse. So I think that the Sympathizer, for as much as his body is in pain from the explosion, this situation kind of sets up a lot of the internal conflict that might be a little bit more dangerous to him and his mental going forward. The Sympathizer is then visited by the 4 Vietnamese extras that played Benny's torturers. They bring along a bottle of Johnny Walker as a get-well-soon gift. The men bring up the coincidental nature of the Sympathizer's accident following his argument with the auteur, who it turns out is actually responsible for sending the scotch. The Sympathizer kind of dismisses the men as being paranoid, and the extras bring up their real reason for their visit. They really wanted to thank the Sympathizer for all that he's done for them, them being the Vietnamese extras on the set throughout the movie. And this really fills the Sympathizer with a feeling of pride that he didn't really know that he needed at this point. He's surprised by his own need for the outward validation, and he again thinks back to when he was first introduced to his spying role by Mom, saying that, you're not going to get any parades, you're not going to get any medals for any of this, as long as you kind of understand in your heart what you're doing. That's going to be the most important thing. But this situation where the Vietnamese refugees and extras kind of give him a little bit of a pat on the back, which he most certainly needs at this point in his life. So in the White Room of the hospital, he is reminded of his first interrogation under the tutelage of Claude. Similarly, the prisoner was kept in an all-white room, which is what initially draws his memory back to these events. Everything in the room is painted white: the bed, the chair, the desk, the bucket that he washes himself with. The air conditioner was kept at a balmy 18 degrees Celsius, which is just 64 degrees Fahrenheit, which is actually pretty damn cold. I say that as a Floridian, so anything below 65 is actually cold for people like me. Speakers in the corner of the room play Hank Williams' Hey Good Lookin' on a continuous loop, except when the sympathizer is present in the room. We learn that the prisoner was the leader of a terrorist cell responsible for countless bomb attacks and assassinations in Saigon. Their trademark was a kind of dual bomb attack, with the second explosion hitting those who came to assist in the wake of the first. And after a week of lights always on, kind of timelessness, and Hank Williams, the sympathizer, finally meets the man that they had been calling the Watchman. So the Watchman is the son of a notable Saigon family of Catholic watchmakers that had since disowned the young man for his communist ideologies. And during their initial conversation, the Watchman confronts the sympathizer with a diatribe on the idea of American innocence. The sympathizer is kind of impressed by the Watchman, and I think that this subtle admiration is really important to note, because at the end of the day, the sympathizer and the Watchman are actually on the same team, which is interesting to kind of think about in this situation, because obviously one is the prisoner and one is the torturer. But underneath the surface, they really are actually on the same team, which is interesting and important. It's an interesting dynamic for sure. The admiration, however, is short-lived, because the Watchman refers to the sympathizer as a bastard, which kind of sets him on the path of burning this guy to the ground. The sympathizer writes a confession for the Watchman, laying out his closeted homosexuality, and this kind of causes the Watchman to break, seeing as though he left his life behind for the revolution. His Catholic family, he left all of that kind of stuff behind for the revolution, and with this confession, the revolution would kind of turn their backs on him, so it kind of leaves him without anywhere left to go. And the satisfaction of breaking the Watchman is kind of short-lived, because only a week after his confession is penned, the Watchman commits suicide by choking himself on a hard-boiled egg. And recalling these events, the sympathizer is once again left defending himself from being a bastard, unless of course he actually is. So like I said, a ton goes on during this chapter, kind of a whirlwind of events. We get so much throughout the chapter, and honestly there's some stuff that I may have missed in terms of events of the chapter. But yeah, the most important through line, I think, from this chapter is kind of the power of the American propaganda machine and the Hamlet kind of existing on that continuum. So, with that being said, let's kind of get into this idea with a little bit more information from the text, kind of backing up this theory and showing us whether or not it's actually true. Alright, so obviously the Hamlet is a work of fiction which takes place inside of another work of fiction, so it's going to be over the top, it's going to be kind of ridiculous, but I think that there's still a lot of important stuff that we can glean here, kind of as a commentary on the reality that it's more or less based on, right? Early in the chapter, the sympathizer kind of puts it perfectly when he says, "Movies were America's way of softening up the rest of the world, Hollywood relentlessly assaulting the mental defenses of audiences with the hit, the smash, the spectacle, the blockbuster, and yes, even the box office bomb." So from the very beginning of the Hamlet storyline, the sympathizer is kind of dealing with the idea of representation and the authenticity of the kind of story that's being told. This all obviously comes to a head in this chapter where the big guns get brought out and the final scenes of the movie are filmed. The sympathizer recalls his early education from Mon, who, in quoting Mao, informs the sympathizer of the importance of art and literature when it comes to politics, which is something that the sympathizer had never really considered before. Mon kind of talks about Mao's speaking on the topic. The sympathizer says, "What mattered was that the audience member, having paid for the ticket, was willing to let American ideas and values seep into the vulnerable tissue of his brain and the absorbent soil of his heart." So I think that this idea is still pretty relevant today, as evidenced by the countless procedural cop dramas that exist, movies and TV shows and even video games regarding the war in the Middle East, and stuff that still even represents the war in Vietnam. The sympathizer refers to the film as absurd, which I think really is the perfect way to describe it. From the very beginning of the process, the sympathizer thought of himself as doing important work, affecting change in a situation where the people were being represented were powerless against the kind of crushing weight of the Hollywood machine. And the story of the Hamlet, the film itself is absurd, to be sure, but the representation of the war and the Vietnamese people is anything but absurd. It's a clearly calculated plot to kind of devalue the truth of the situation and replace it with a storyline that Hollywood created. It's important to kind of remember why we're here in the first place, right? Remember the reason that we hear about the Hamlet in the first place. It's through the congressman who is attempting to kind of control, or if not necessarily control, then influence the kind of stories that are coming out of Hollywood. The congressman invites the general to read the script and vet its accuracy, and the only people that really have ties to the film before the sympathizer gets involved are trying to paint the Vietnamese people in a certain light, and one that's not particularly positive, kind of as evidenced by Seamus saying early in the chapter that all Vietnamese people are VC when Mama San is killed. So I think that the storyline itself is an important commentary on the Hollywood machine being a tool for American propaganda, because of the fact that the only people who are involved they have a vested interest in the story that they're trying to tell being the one that's told. Sure, they're pretty close to the actual end of the war, and people are still reeling from the effects, both physical and mental, that the war has or has had. But still, we're nearly 2 years away from the kind of close of the war in any meaningful way. So 2 years is a long time, long enough for people to kind of start to forget a lot of the day-to-day experiences of the time, So I think that the film is important because it's trying to tell people what they should remember. It's trying to paint a picture of the events that are not authentic in the slightest. It's trying to tell a story that's untrue, and it's important to understand that the people in power are the ones telling this story. So the story is being told from a very particular perspective, and it's not necessarily the reality of the situation that's kind of being showcased with this film. And another aspect of that is that it's not just for American audiences either. The film is expected to be the sympathizer talks about Hollywood softening up audiences worldwide with these kinds of films, and I think that's an important thing to understand as well. He kind of boils it down perfectly in the lines right before the cemetery explosion, and I'm going to read those word for word just because I think that it's probably the most important passage in terms of understanding the way that the sympathizer feels about the film in general, as well as the way that the author feels about this kind of thing, and their relationship to the propaganda machine. The Sympathizer says, the movie was just a sequel to our war and a prequel to the next one that America was destined to wage. Killing the extras was either a reenactment of what had happened to us natives or a dress rehearsal for the next such episode, with the movie the local anesthetic applied to the American mind, preparing it for any minor irritation before or after such a deed. Ultimately, the technology used to actually obliterate natives came from the military-industrial complex of which Hollywood was a part, doing its dutiful role in the artificial obliteration of natives. So yeah, that's pretty much the gist, I think, that I'm trying to make with this whole the Hamlet as a propaganda instrument conversation. You know, it's not just about retelling the events of the Vietnam War in a way that kind of make us look favorable and make the Vietnamese people look worse. It's also an attempt to kind of convince the American people that this kind of thing is normal and necessary and it's just what happens. You know, when you have a system that's kind of propped up by the oppression of others, it's important to kind of desensitize your people in order to, you know, make them complicit. Yeah, make them complicit in that oppression, you know, and through films like this at the time and even up to a certain point now, you know, I think, and we've talked about this before, you know, how the Hollywood industrial complex is able to pick and choose stories to tell, and with the advent of social media and the internet, you know, we're really able to get a better perspective of the reality of the world in a way that people didn't really have up until very, very recently in human history. So I think it's really, really important to kind of understand the way that this situation is being used to rewrite the history of the war and paint the Vietnamese people in a certain light. And I think that we get a little bit of this as well from the Watchmen scene when he confronts the Sympathizer during his interrogation. He says that they're all guilty until proven innocent, and if that were not true, then why are they all considered VC? And, you know, this is something that the auteur states directly through Seamus in the film. You know, he says they're all VC, you know. So I think it's important to kind of understand the way that the auteur thinks about the Vietnamese people and the way that the kind of Hollywood industrial complex wants people to think about the Vietnamese people. You know, it's not trying to paint them in some kind of positive light with, you know, them being a victim of a couple of bad actors or whatever it is. You know, it's very black and white in stating they're all bad guys. And just to say that the VC are the bad guys, you know, I think that that's an important distinction to make too. But yeah, I think that for the most part, you know, a lot of this chapter kind of deals with the idea of the Hamlet being an instrument of propaganda and the Sympathizer kind of coming to terms with his inability to stop anything that's going on around him. You know, he kind of, when he gets into it, he tells himself that he's going to be, you know, a cultural liaison to make things more authentic, and he's going to affect change and, you know, make this thing work and help the Vietnamese people get portrayed in a more favorable light and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, I don't think that the Sympathizer is really capable of doing any of that. You know, he's kind of just a victim of his circumstances, and unfortunately he becomes a victim of an explosion. You know, he almost gets killed because of his involvement in the film. Again, is it an accident? The Sympathizer has kind of convinced himself that it wasn't, but the auteur maintains that it was. You know, it's hard to really see. I think that you can kind of believe one way or the other and convince yourself one way or the other. I, for one, think that it probably was not an accident, but at the same time, I mean, maybe eventually we'll get confirmation one way or the other, but as of right now, I think that it's kind of up in the air and left to the interpretation of the reader. But like I was saying, I think that the Sympathizer is just coming to terms with the fact that he is kind of powerless in this situation, and that, you know, the Hollywood industrial complex, the military industrial complex, they're kind of working in tandem here in order to rewrite the history of the war and to showcase America as not only the good guys, but the good guys who won the war. I think that that's it for chapter 11. I feel like I kind of rushed through a bunch of stuff. Maybe didn't get my point across as well as I wanted to in some cases. But yeah, let me know what you thought about this chapter. If I missed anything, please give me a shout. We are now almost, I would say probably halfway through the book. Maybe not half. We have to get through chapter 12, and then we'll officially be halfway through the book because there's 23 chapters. So almost halfway through the book. I'm really glad about the way that things are kind of progressing. I'm enjoying the book a lot so far. Hopefully you are too. Yeah, let me know what you thought about the chapter. Let me know if I missed anything important. As always, thank you so much for sticking around, and I look forward to catching you on the next one.